London, 1599. A cold evening. Along the banks of the Thames, a small gathering of merchants stood huddled together. No king was present, no general, no display of military might. Just a handful of men with a dream burning in their eyes, a dream of spices, silk, and fortune from the distant lands of the East. Queen Elizabeth I granted this group a royal charter to trade with the East, and so the East India Company was born. Not one of them, not even the merchants themselves, had the faintest idea that this small trading company would one day redraw the map of the entire world. This story does not begin with a great conquest. It does not begin with a war cry. It begins with something far simpler, the desire to make a profit. But history has proven, again and again, that the most dangerous empires are never the ones that arrive with swords. They're the ones that arrive with paper and contracts, because their true intentions stay hidden until it is far too late. The company's first ship set sail in 1601, bound for the shores of India and Southeast Asia, not with conquest in mind, but with a simple goal: buying pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. In Europe, these spices were worth their weight in gold, and whichever company controlled their supply could earn unimaginable wealth. In its early years, the company's conduct was humble, almost meek. Its representatives arrived at the courts of local rulers bearing gifts, asking permission to trade, and wherever permission was granted, they built small trading posts, factories, they called them. These were not fortresses, they were warehouses, offices. But with every warehouse, slowly, a small guard detachment followed. And that right there was the point where the tide of history began, quietly, to turn. Because wherever wealth accumulates, the need for protection follows. And whoever picks up a weapon to protect wealth eventually learns to use that same weapon to seize power. This was a lesson the company would learn very quickly indeed. Throughout the 17th century, the East India Company planted its feet along three major coastal regions of India: Surat and Bombay on the west coast, Madras in the south, and Calcutta in the east. In every place, the story unfolded almost identically. The company would ask the local Nawab, Raja, or Sultan for permission to trade, promise to pay taxes, and in return receive a small plot of land to build its warehouse. The Mughal emperor, still powerful at the time, saw no threat in this modest commercial activity. After all, these were merchants, and merchants brought tax revenue, which was good news for the treasury. But one detail was overlooked, a detail that would prove fatal. The company was permitted to keep armed men to guard its warehouses. At first, these were mere handfuls of soldiers, tasked only with defending goods from bandits and pirates. But slowly, these small detachments grew into full armies. The company began recruiting local soldiers sepoys. They were called trained and commanded by British officers. It was a strange and unsettling arrangement. Indian soldiers on Indian soil being prepared by a foreign company to fight against their own countrymen. Meanwhile, in Europe, rival powers had already entered the field: the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, each with its own East India Company, each with its eyes fixed on India's riches. The rivalry stopped being purely commercial. It turned into a quiet war, where every European power tried to use local rulers for its own advantage. The rivalry between the British and French companies erupted into a series of small wars across southern India. And it was in these wars that a young English officer proved his mettle, Robert Clive, a name that was about to reshape the destiny of an entire subcontinent. This was the moment the company first realized that the true source of power in India was not trade, it was political influence and military dominance. And the day that realization took hold, the company's true face began to reveal itself. Bengal, with its fertile land and abundant wealth, was considered India's most valuable province. Within it stood the city of Calcutta, where the British had built their strongest trading post. In 1756, Bengal's Nawab, Alivardi Khan, died, and the throne passed to his young grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was an emotional, impatient young ruler, deeply angered by the company's growing power and its fortifications built without permission. He suspected the company was interested in far more than trade, that it wanted political power, and that suspicion was not baseless in the slightest. the Nawab ordered the company to tear down the additional fortifications it had built in Calcutta. The British ignored the order. In response, Siraj-ud-Dowlah marched on Calcutta with his army and seized the city. This is where the event now remembered in history as the Black Hole of Calcutta enters the story. British chroniclers claim that a number of English prisoners were locked inside a cramped cell, where many suffocated to death. Historians remain sharply divided on the truth of this account, and many modern researchers consider it an exaggeration, later used as political justification. But at the time, for company officials sitting in London and Madras, it became the perfect excuse. Robert Clive was sent to Bengal with a large force, ostensibly to retake Calcutta, but the real goal was far bigger, placing a puppet ruler on Bengal's throne, one who would answer to the company. Before the battle even began, Clive took a hidden path. He reached out to disgruntled, powerful men inside the Nawab's own court chief, among them Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own commander-in-chief, who coveted the throne for himself. A secret deal was struck. If Mir Jafar kept his troops idle during the battle, he would be made Nawab once the fighting was done. This was the foundation of betrayal, upon which one of history's most decisive battles was about to be fought. The 23rd of June 1757, a date etched forever into the fate of the subcontinent. On the field of Plassey, along the banks of the Bhagirathi River, two armies stood face to face. On paper, this looked like an impossibly one-sided battle. Siraj-ud-Dowlah commanded nearly 50,000 soldiers. Robert Clive had barely 3,000. If this had been a simple matter of numbers, the outcome would have been obvious. But a battle is never won by numbers alone. The battle opened with the roar of cannon fire, smoke spreading thick across the field, but as time wore on, an eerie silence settled over a large portion of the Nawab's army. Mir Jafar, who commanded the Nawab's largest contingent, ordered his men to hold their ground and not engage. Loyal generals like Mir Madan fought bravely and died, but their sacrifice was in vain, because the rest of the army stood by, watching, numb and unmoved. The moment Siraj-ud-Dowlah understood his own commander's silent betrayal, his courage broke. He chose to flee the battlefield, hoping to find refuge somewhere safe and regroup his strength. But fate had written something else for him entirely. During his escape, he was captured, and on the orders of Mir Jafar's son, he was brutally put to death. A young ruler who had once sat upon the throne of Bengal became, within a matter of days, first a fugitive and then a corpse. What happened that day on the field of Plassey was not merely the outcome of a battle. It was a message, one that would echo for the next 2 centuries, that conquering India required no cannons. It only required weak, purchasable loyalties within. With 3,000 men, Clive defeated an army of 50,000 through nothing more than a secret deal, and so began a chain of events that would redraw the map of an entire subcontinent. After the Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar was made Nawab of Bengal, exactly as promised. But this was not a throne of power, it was a throne of servitude. Mir Jafar became a puppet ruler, one whose every decision required the company's seal of approval. He was immediately forced to pay the company a massive sum as compensation for the loss at Calcutta, for war expenses, and as personal gifts for senior company officials, Clive included. Bengal's treasury, once counted among the richest in India, began emptying within months. This plunder was not a one-time event, it became a permanent system. The company began collecting taxes from Bengal's lands, but this revenue no longer went toward the province's welfare. It went straight to Britain, or into the personal pockets of company officials. Soon, Mir Jafar himself grew weary of the company's endless financial demands, and when he tried to resist, the company removed him without hesitation and installed his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, in his place. The pattern continued. Whichever Nawab refused to bow to the company's demands was simply removed from the throne. Throughout all this, the people of Bengal bore the worst economic burden imaginable. Crops were seized from farmers by force. Artisans were forced to work for a pittance. And in 1770, Bengal was struck by a catastrophic famine that killed millions from starvation, a famine historians still debate today. Was it merely a natural disaster, or the direct result of the company's greed? The company that once traded in spices was now running the economy of an entire province by its own will, and its priority was profit, never human life. When news of the victory at Plassey and the plunder that followed reached London, the reaction was mixed. On one side, the company's shareholders celebrated profits had climbed higher than ever before. On the other, questions began rising in the British Parliament. Why should a private trading company hold such immense political and military power? Robert Clive, who had returned home carrying enormous personal wealth, faced a parliamentary inquiry over accusations of corruption and abuse of power for personal gain. Though he escaped the charges, the episode proved that even within Britain itself, people were growing uneasy about just how unchecked the company had become. In 1773, the British government intervened for the first time, passing the Regulating Act to establish some oversight over the company's affairs. It was a turning point, an admission that this was no longer merely a trading matter, but the management of an entire empire. Yet, that oversight was never complete. The company kept strengthening its military and administrative power, and over the following century, one by one, the remaining Indian states fell to the same method that had first been tested in Bengal, either through treaties or through defeat on the battlefield. Tipu Sultan, ruler of Mysore, remembered in history as the Tiger of Mysore, resisted the company for years but ultimately fell in 1799, sacrificing his own life. The Maratha Empire, once India's greatest power, weakened gradually through a series of wars. The Sikh Empire, thrown into internal turmoil after the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, eventually bowed before the British as well. Here, a fundamental question arises, one that troubles every student of history. India was not some weak or undeveloped land. This was home to the Mughal Empire, once counted among the richest and most powerful empires on earth, its economy larger than the combined economies of Europe. So, how was it possible that a relatively small trading company, arriving from an island thousands of miles away, came to conquer such a vast land? The answer was never out there. It was hidden within. Aurangzeb died in 1707, and after him, the Mughal Empire declined rapidly. One weak ruler after another took the throne, provincial governors grew independent, and Nadir Shah's invasion of 1,739 devastated Delhi so thoroughly that Mughal grandeur never truly recovered. India was no longer a unified empire. It had fractured into dozens of small states, whose rulers did not trust one another and often plotted against each other instead. Nawabs, Rajas, Sultans, each one obsessed with strengthening his own kingdom. And in pursuit of that goal, many sought British military help without ever realizing they were inviting their own enemy onto their own soil. This is the lesson history repeats again and again, and the lesson that is ignored again and again. Great empires rarely fall to outside force. They fall from the cracks within mistrust, envy, self-interest, and the absence of unity. The East India Company invented no new weapon. It simply walked through the door that the decline of the Mughal Empire and the rivalries of India's own states had already left wide open. In the 100 years following Plassey, what had begun as a trading company slowly transformed into a full-fledged government. The company now had its own courts, its own prisons, its own tax system, and an army of hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers, commanded by British officers, used to conquer more and more of their own homeland. In 1857, a rebellion erupted, one the British called the Mutiny, and Indian history remembers as the First War of Independence, a revolt that shook the company to its foundations. The details of this uprising, its leaders, and its outcome will be the subject of our next episode. The 10th of May, 1857. In the cantonment of Meerut, a spark caught, and within days, it would set the whole of India ablaze. The story begins, almost absurdly, with a handful of cartridges. New Enfield rifles had arrived, and with them, a rumor spread like wildfire that the cartridges were greased with the fat of cows and pigs. To Hindu soldiers, this was an unforgivable sacrilege. To Muslim soldiers, it was no less. But this was never really a story about grease. It was the detonation of decades of accumulated resentment, humiliation, and exploitation. Grease was simply the excuse it had been waiting for. When a group of sepoys refused to bite the cartridges, as army procedure required, they were stripped of their uniforms in public, chained, and marched off in disgrace in front of their own regiment. The humiliation was calculated to break their spirit. Instead, it lit a fuse. The very next day, their fellow soldiers, unable to contain their fury any longer, turned their weapons on their own British officers. Blood spilled, fires were lit, and the spark that had ignited in Meerut spread first to Delhi, then to Kanpur, to Lucknow, to Jhansi faster than any telegraph could report it. The rebel sepoys marched toward Delhi and knelt before the aging Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, declaring him once again the Emperor of India. Here was a man with no army of his own, no treasury, nothing left but a name, and yet that name alone was enough to rekindle hope in the hearts of a broken people. This was never merely a mutiny of soldiers. It became something far larger, a rising in which kings, peasants, artisans, and ordinary sepoys stood, if only for a moment, in the same line. Rani Lakshmibai, the Queen of Jhansi, strapped her infant son to her back and rode into battle with a sword in her hand. Nana Sahib raised the banner of revolt in Kanpur. And in Delhi, an old poet emperor made one final desperate attempt to breathe life back into a throne that history had already begun to bury. But for all its courage, the rebellion was never a coordinated plan. Each region fought its own battle. There was no central command, no shared strategy, no single voice that could unite the many uprisings into one force. The company, stunned and disoriented in the first weeks, gathered itself and called for reinforcements from Britain. City after rebel city began to fall. Delhi was retaken. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured and exiled to Rangoon, the last living symbol of 400 years of Mughal history, spending his final days alone and powerless on foreign soil, writing verses of loss that no one in power cared to hear. Rani Lakshmibai died on the battlefield, sword in hand, and her name remains, to this day, one of the brightest chapters in Indian history, a symbol not of defeat, but of defiance. What happened to those who were captured is remembered as one of the darkest chapters of the entire era. Sepoys were tied to the mouths of cannons and blown apart. Mass hangings lined roadsides for miles. Entire villages were burned to the ground on mere suspicion. The scale of the vengeance was so brutal that even a number of British officers later questioned it in private letters and official reports. But when the smoke finally cleared, the result was undeniable. The rebellion had been crushed. And from the ashes of that defeat, a new era was born, one in which no company, however powerful, would ever again be trusted with the governance of a subcontinent. From this point forward, the British Crown itself would rule India directly. In 1858, the East India Company was formally dissolved, and India passed directly under British government control. In 1876, Queen Victoria was given the title Empress of India, but this was no longer a story about India alone. This was the era in which the British Empire climbed toward the very peak of its global reach. Across Africa, from Egypt down to the Cape of South Africa, the British flag rose over new territory. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the islands of the Caribbean, vast stretches of the Far East piece by piece, nearly a quarter of the Earth's land and a quarter of its population came to live beneath the shadow of the British Crown. It was in this era that the famous phrase was coined, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." But this towering height stood on precisely the same foundation as the Battle of Plassey a century earlier. Plunder, exploitation, and the ruthless extraction of local resources dressed up as progress. India's own textile industries were deliberately dismantled so that British factory goods could flood its markets unopposed. Railways were laid across the subcontinent, not for the convenience of Indian travelers, but to move British troops and British cargo faster. An education system was built not to enlighten a nation, but to manufacture a class of clerks fluent enough in English to serve the machinery of colonial administration. Behind every modernization, there was always the same quiet calculation. Whose benefit does this truly serve? And the answer was never the people who lived there. The 20th century arrived, and with it, the storm that would finally shake the empire's foundations loose. In 1914, the First World War erupted, and Britain drew soldiers from across its colonies to fight and die in trenches thousands of miles from home. Over 1,300,000 Indian soldiers fought in the fields of Europe and the deserts of the Middle East for a war that had nothing to do with them, in a conflict between empires they owed no loyalty to. In exchange for this sacrifice, promises were made greater self-rule, a real voice in governing their own land. The war ended, the promises did not survive it. Instead, in 1919, a massacre unfolded in the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar that stripped away whatever loyalty still remained toward British rule in Indian hearts. On the orders of General Dyer, unarmed men, women, and children gathered peacefully to celebrate a festival. Trapped inside a walled garden with only one narrow exit, were fired upon without warning, without mercy, and without any chance to flee. Hundreds died where they stood. That single afternoon became the spark that reignited the entire independence movement, this time with a fire that could no longer be smothered. Mohandas Gandhi began his campaign of nonviolent resistance, turning ordinary defiance a boycott, a walk to the sea to make salt into a weapon no empire had ever faced before. Muhammad Ali Jinnah rose as the voice demanding political rights and safeguards for India's Muslims. Subhash Chandra Bose chose an entirely different path, one of armed struggle and open confrontation. The movements diverged, their methods clashed, their leaders disagreed bitterly among themselves, but the destination, however contested the road, was the same: freedom. Then, in 1939, the Second World War arrived, and once again, India was pulled into a war it had never chosen, without so much as being consulted. But this time, Britain itself emerged from the conflict exhausted, indebted, and diminished, fighting, in truth, for its own survival rather than its supremacy. The empire that had once seemed unshakable now stood buckling beneath its own weight, propped up by little more than habit and inertia. By the war's end, Britain no longer possessed the financial strength, the military capacity, or the moral authority to continue ruling India. And yet, even in its final act of departure, British strategy reached once more for its oldest and most familiar tool: divide, and then withdrawal. The growing distance between Hindu and Muslim political leadership, a distance that colonial policy itself had long nurtured and deepened for its own convenience, was fanned further in these final years. In 1947, a line drawn in haste, reportedly completed by a British lawyer who had never set foot in India before being handed the task, split the subcontinent into two nations, India and Pakistan. That partition arrived carrying both the joy of long-awaited freedom and one of the largest forced migrations, and one of the most harrowing episodes of bloodshed in recorded human history. Millions became strangers overnight in the very homes they had lived in for generations. Estimates of the dead run into the hundreds of thousands, by some counts far higher. The wounds that partition carved into the subcontinent have not fully healed even now, generations later. On the night between the 14th and 15th of August, 1947, the sun that had never set on the British Empire finally sank beneath the horizon of the Indian subcontinent. This time for good. But that sunset was not confined to one land alone. Over the following 2 decades, colony after colony across Africa and Asia, Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, and dozens more claimed their independence in turn. The empire that had once ruled over a quarter of the globe shrank, piece by piece, until what remained was little more than a scattering of islands and a memory of what it once was. The final question, left for every empire. And so, 200 years after it began, the story that had started with a handful of merchants and a modest trading charter reached its end. An empire that once believed its power was eternal came apart in the same way every empire eventually does, crushed beneath the weight of its own greed and undone by the very nations it had tried to silence, but whose spirit it could never fully break. Those few traders, standing on the banks of the Thames in 1599, dreaming of spices and silk, could never have imagined that their small ambition would one day be written in the deaths of millions, in the collapse of a great empire, and in the still open wound of a divided land. History offers us this same lesson over and over in every age. No empire, however vast, can stand forever on a foundation of greed and cruelty. Sooner or later, the nations that are pressed down reclaim their voice, and once that voice rises, no cannon, no army, no flag can silence it again. The question was never whether an empire would fall that much. History has already settled. The real question is this: will the powers of today, so certain of their own invincibility, learn anything at all from this history? Or will they simply repeat the same mistakes, dressed in new uniforms, under a different flag? This was the complete story of the British Empire, from a company to an empire to its fall. History buried it. We brought it back.